So this is going to be the last tier list of the expansion because 1, a new expansion's coming out in like 2 weeks, and 2, I'm going on vacation. So let's just jump into it. The best decks to climb are going to be 1, Beast Hunter. Beast Hunter is just one of the strongest decks in the game right now across the board. Once you include Prince Renathal, its biggest weakness, which was aggro, was kind of taken back a little bit because you now start with 10 extra HP. Has the highest win rate from Diamond through Legend. It's like the 4th highest win rate deck in top 1000 Legend, and at most other levels of play, you can probably climb with just about anything, so this deck would do perfectly fine. Overall, I really like this deck. I like Hunter. It's not pure aggressive, so it's not just going to be face, but you still get to play big beasts, and you have that good feeling of like what a Hunter should be, right? Summoning big beasts, slamming in the face, hero powering them. It just feels really fun to play, in my opinion. It's a pretty mid-rangey deck, so if you don't like pure aggro and you don't like control, this is a great deck for you. So the next deck on the list is going to be Mech Mage, which was a little bit interesting to me, but when I talked to people on Hype Horizon, it made a little bit more sense. Basically, you have more time with 40 card decks to basically get value out of all of your Discover mechanics. You have a ton of damage with Mecha Shark, which you can reduce in cost with the Seafloor Gateway, and then you can finish off your opponent over the top with things like Fireball. It just basically has a lot of reach and a lot of snowball potential, so it just has been doing really well recently. And the main mulligans you want to look for in this deck are anything 2 or less, Mecha Shark, Seafloor Gateway, the rest basically just dump. So the next deck on this list is going to be Big Spell Mage, which has dropped a little bit since the last couple of tier lists, but that's mostly because of the fact that like people have learned kind of how to play against it at the end of the day, right? Like people realize, okay, if I'm playing against Big Spell Mage, I need to play the coin as soon as they give it to me. I need to play as many cheese spells as possible so they don't get cheese value out of the Barbaric Sorceress. And as people slowly learn to get better and better against this deck, the deck has lowered in win rate a little bit. Then again, though, you're still able to pretty often cheese out a Rune of the Archmage and Drakefire Amulet several turns before you're supposed to actually play them, which can still be very hard for any deck to deal with, as well as having like super good late game value with the Magister. So it's still a very solid deck and is still number 3, but overall is just a little bit weaker than it has been. So the next deck on this list is going to be Prestor Druid. This deck basically speaks for itself. You want to play Lady Prestor as soon as possible. You have multiple different ways of drawing it with Jerry Rig Carpenter to get you Capture Coldtooth Mine, Capture Coldtooth Mine in general, decent card draw in the deck, as well as Moonlit Guidance and some Dredge with the Aquatic Form just in case. And then the last thing is you can actually play it a turn early with Innervate, the coin, or if you play SI Skulker and Capture Coldtooth Mine on turn 4, it makes Lady Prestor cost 5 mana on turn 5. So basically, you play Prestor as soon as possible, you outvalue your opponent with a ton of cheap dragons, and there really isn't that much they can do about it unless you super low roll on dragons, which happens sometimes, but I'd say a good 80% of the time, if you play Lady Prestor, you're probably going to win the game. So the next deck on this list is Mech Paladin. Can't really go wrong with Mech Paladin. Although it's not the strongest deck in the game, it's relatively cheap, very simple to play. You just snowball the stats, give all of your minions Divine Shield with Bubble Bot if you can, and you win the game. Mulligans for the deck are basically just as many cheap 1 and 2 cost Mech minions as possible, and then keep Bubble Bot so you can basically play it on 4 and snowball the board even harder. If you don't have Bubble Bot though, it's not a big deal. You could just draw it later and play it on an even bigger board. It's really up to you. And then obviously you want to finish the game off, if you haven't already, with Lightforged Carriel and just bopping up a couple last few times. It's very strong, very simple, pretty cheap deck. The next deck is Control Murloc Shaman, and this deck is a little bit more intricate than a lot of the other decks on this list. You have several different win conditions, whether it be with the Murloc package for the early mid-game with Clownfish, drawing cards, along with Flurgle and a couple of other things. You could also, as well as the Amalgam, you could also win the game in the mid-game with Snowfall Guardian, just freezing the board over and over and over again until they can't do anything. You could win the game late game by eating a win condition with Mutanus and then copying that battle cry with like a Brilliant Macaw as well as Bolner and or Bran. And then super late game, if you haven't won the game already, Brucon is a great way to finish him off with a free fireball, and then basically getting a fireball once every 4 turns roughly. So overall, the deck has good draw, good removal, several different win conditions, a very flexible deck. It's just kind of hard to play. So the last official deck on this list is going to be Quest Priest. And honestly, Quest Priest is a lot better than I think this tier list gives it credit for. But because it has 3 basically unwinnable matchups, Boar Priest, Celestial Light Druid, and Control Shaman if they draw Mutanus, because those 3 really bad matchups that make the deck look unplayable, I think it just gets a slightly bad rep. But overall, I'm like 11-2 with this deck, the only 2 losses being against a Celestial Alignment Druid, as well as 1 Control Shaman. against everything else, you have a response like everything. You have some pretty efficient cheap removal with the Lightmaw Nether Drake, which is a good board wipe. You have cheap big removal with Xyrella. You've got some silence. You've got Serena, which can basically deal with an individual big minion as well as stealing their stats. And then if you hit late game, you have enough healing, big minions, and removal with things like Whirlpool as well to just win the game. Like, if you can get to turn 6, at that point, you basically won the game, and this deck is very good at getting to turn 6. So overall, I think this deck is a lot better than people give it credit for. I will admit it's a control deck and kind of boring, and people do find it toxic, so it might not necessarily be what you want to play, but I actually very much enjoy this deck. And now on to 2 honorable mentions. These are ones that I put on here that weren't necessarily on the Hype Horizon tier list page. The first one is going to be Curse Warlock. You can run this deck in a couple of different ways. You could run it with the quest, or you could run it without the quest. I do not like the quest very much, though. I think the quest is, for the most part, unnecessary. Like, if you take out 2 or 3 cards for the quest as well as an unstable Shadow Bolt, I just feel like you're missing out on a couple of other things. You also might run like a Hellfire and a couple of other cards that deal damage to yourself. Not to mention that after you play Tamsin, your hero power no longer does damage to you. So overall, I like the version without a quest even more, because you can optimize your deck better. You can play cards like Emulate to just make control matchups a lot easier. You can play cards like Rune Mithril Rod, so you can reduce the cost of other cards in your deck depending on what build you're going. So overall, I think the version without the quest is better, but it's really up to you, because the quest makes the mirror matchup basically a guaranteed win, and into slow control matchups, you still inevitably win in the late game fatigue value. And the last honorable mention on this list is going to be Quest Hunter. Quest Hunter is just extremely strong right now. Now that you have 40 cards, you get to deal even more damage with hero power because you have more spells in your deck. Since decks are a little bit slower, you're not going to get run down by aggro super hard, which was one of this deck's bigger weaknesses, unless you could draw an early explosive trap. So put that together, and you have a very, very strong deck. Overall, I think that this deck is probably one of the strongest decks in the game, but because it's only risen in the popularity within the last like 2-ish weeks, maybe a little bit less, it's not necessarily like an official top tier deck yet, but I think it does deserve to be on this tier list. So overall, I would recommend these decks. If we missed any, not a big deal. There are a lot of other viable decks. I think the meta is extremely healthy right now. So if you want to play something else like Murloc Shaman or Murloc Warlock or Beast Druid or normal Ramp Druid or Hero Power Mage, you name it. All of these decks are pretty viable and you can still climb with. These are just the ones that we think here at Hype Horizon are the overall best. And this is basically ranging over a large like ranking scale, right? Like as a content creator, like to give you guys decks that are maybe a little bit better at the lower ranks, but are more competitive players, like putting decks that are good at the highest ranks and even in some competitive play. So it's a very wide range of decks, so it means we can't necessarily include everything. So these are the best decks in our opinion. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, as well as check out Hype Horizon in the link below. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.